So today we're going to be discussing the microbiome and mental health, treating bipolar 1 disorder with FMT, fecal microbiota transplant. Research into the gut microbiome has exploded over the last few years. The link between the gut-brain axis and mental illness is now well established in the literature, and clinical trials are popping up around the world targeting the gut microbiome through various means to treat depression, anxiety, and complex mental illness such as bipolar. Jane and Alexander Dudley are the first people in the world to successfully treat bipolar 1 disorder through FMT. Jane suffered from severe and treatment-resistant bipolar 1 disorder for 18 years. In 2016, Alexander read a journal article linking the gut microbiome to depression in rodents, and although there were no human studies at the time, he thought that the gut microbiome may be linked to Jane's severe symptoms. Under the guidance of Jane's psychiatrist, they decided to experiment with FMT to treat Jane's debilitating and life-threatening symptoms. The experiment was a phenomenal success, and they believe that they've cured an incurable mental illness. Jane has now been 100% symptom-free for over 3 years and has been off all medications since August 2017. Her case study has just been published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Jane and Alexander Dudley for an in-depth interview into their remarkable journey from severe mental illness to well-being. Welcome, Jane and Alexander.
Hi, Michelle. Good to be here.
Hey. So let's start. Jane, can you just tell us a little bit about when you developed bipolar disorder, what the symptoms were, and what did your life really look like at that time?
Sure. Well, when I was 16 is when I developed serious mental illness. I had a pretty traumatic childhood, and I would say in retrospect that I experienced depression and anxiety, but I was still quite functional. I was still able to go to school, etc. But in my teenage years, I experienced sexual trauma, which really changed, affected me very deeply. And from that trauma, I became physically unwell and developed chronic tonsillitis. And basically my GP put me on antibiotics, which was the thing to do when you have tonsillitis, but I kept getting tonsillitis. It was recurrent. And over about a 2-year period, I took maybe 12 courses of antibiotics. And that's now relevant from our experience of healing bipolar. But at the time, I didn't see that the antibiotic use was relevant at all. I assumed that the severe mental illness that I was experiencing was only caused by the sexual trauma that I experienced, and probably a combination of childhood trauma. And also in my family, mental illness is a really complex thing, and there are many factors that I think really contribute to it developing within people. But in my own case, I think it was a combination of a family history of mental illness, trauma, and then the final clincher that we now really believe was the thing that caused severe mental illness was overuse of antibiotics, which basically just completely destroyed my gut microbiome. Because from that age, I became very sick very quickly. I dropped out of school and basically became functionally disabled from the age of 16 until mid-30s. Because the depression that I experienced was so profound and so ongoing and so deep and so dark that I spent most of my adult life being suicidal. And I didn't actually get a bipolar diagnosis until I was 29, but it's a really hard thing to diagnose because you have to have a history of psychosis and things like that. So there are 2 forms of bipolar. There's bipolar 1 disorder and bipolar 2 disorder. Bipolar 1 is the most severe form, where you experience you experience mania, you experience profound depression and mania. And so depression can be so severe that you are suicidal, and the mania can be so severe. Like it's like the opposite end of the scale where you lose touch with reality and you go into psychosis for weeks on end. And then there's bipolar 2 disorder, which isn't fun either, but it's just not quite as severe as bipolar 1 disorder. Yeah, so I would say I was severely mentally ill from the age of 16 and life was not fun.
You did spend quite a bit of time in psychiatric institutions.
And yeah, and I've been hospitalized about a dozen times from either being a danger to myself via being suicidal or through losing touch with reality when I'm manic. And unfortunately, like a lot of people cope. A lot of people live with bipolar disorder quite well. They, medication works for them. They keep their symptoms under control. And, a large percentage of people with bipolar disorder can live fulfilling, rich lives. They can work, they can study, they can raise families. But I was not someone who was able to do that. My symptoms were so severe that I needed to be cared for. Basically, I couldn't care for myself. And so I needed family or partners to look after my basic needs, really. And unfortunately, medications only ever stopped me from being suicidal. They never gave me any level of functionality. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we kind of looked for other options, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was basically Jane in circumstances that she should have been very happy in a way. Like we were in a new relationship. We were in a lovely setting. We had access to nature and food. She wasn't under any stress at all, and yet she was still broken by her depression. Mm-hmm. And it was an awful thing to see. You wouldn't want your dog to be suffering like that, let alone a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. So the level of suffering was extreme, and the disability was, complete. Really, I spent vast stretches of time not being able, barely being able to get out of bed. And then I lived for the mania, which occurred maybe twice a year. And even though it was enjoyable for me, it was really not enjoyable for people around me, because I would lose touch with reality, and then I'd start talking to my alien friends, and then I would leave my body and go on these intergalactic journeys with my mind, but my body was still here.
Talking gibberish, wandering around naked, completely uncontrollable, with no, you had to watch Jane like a hawk, because she would drink whatever fluid was around. She had absolutely no impulse control whatsoever. And she really was a genuine danger to herself and occasionally to those around her as well.
And so that's when I'd have to be hospitalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So bipolar disorder, it's not fun.
No, not at all. Not for the person experiencing it or for family or friends around. Yeah. I want to get a bit more into that in a little bit and hear more about how that affected you, Alex. But first of all, I know that Alex was so integral to your journey and how you've come through this and the treatment. So I'd like to go back and just ask a little bit about your relationship and how you actually met. How did that happen?
Well, we met through a frog, which I think was a really cute story. So I had spent maybe...
I'm a herpetologist. I study reptiles and amphibians, by the way.
So basically I spent 2 years going in and out of hospital. I was rapidly cycling from severe depression to mania, and I had tried to commit suicide a few times, thankfully unsuccessfully. But the thing about suicide is if you are successful in your first attempt, you don't see the effect that it has on your family. But if you fail, you see what it does to your family. And even though I was suffering, I had nothing to hold on to. There was nothing, the suffering that I experienced was so complete and so ongoing and all pervading that I didn't think I could stand it. And so, you know, that's why I attempted suicide. But luckily, thank God, was something I was really bad at. And I saw what it did to my family. And so I had to make a decision. I had to live. I decided that I couldn't go through with it, and I had to work out how to live. And I didn't. Hospital is not a place you go to get well. It's simply a place that stops you from dying, basically. It's not rehabilitation. So after I stabilized a little bit to a point where I was able to go out into the world again, I had to think of a place that I could go to truly rehabilitate. And I had the amazing opportunity to live on a biodynamic farm in the Hunter Valley called Purple Pear. And it's a permaculture farm. And I lived there for free in exchange for working in the garden, because I thought getting back to nature and gardening would be good for my mental health. Because one of the jobs that I did before I got sick was I was doing landscape gardening, basically. And that was being outdoors and working in nature had shown me that it was really good for my mental health. So I thought that's what I'd do. And working on this farm, I kept finding these frogs in my raincoat, as you do. And then one day I found a frog that I'd never seen before, and it had green spots and it shimmered like emeralds in the sunlight, and I thought it was a magical frog, and I needed to know about it, and I didn't know how to identify it. But then I remembered my sister had this friend who was a herpetologist who could identify the frog. So I sent him a photo on Facebook and we started chatting. And then within a week, we knew that we'd spend the rest of our lives together, and that was...
Can confirm.
6 years ago.
Yeah, 6.5.
6.5. And luckily, Alex had no idea what bipolar disorder meant.
Had no clue.
But he found out.
We sure did.
How did Jane's condition affect you and your relationship, Alex?
It was interesting. I mean, I could, like, for nearly the first year, all I saw was her depression. I didn't see her mania.
But what did my depression look like?
Yeah, depression was hard. It was, you know, like, we'd go to these beautiful places and I could see that Jane was hurting so much that she couldn't really enjoy it. She'd occasionally have little snippets of joy, but a lot of the time it was. Well,
as anyone who's ever been depressed, and if you've been severely depressed, you know that, like, joy is impossible. It's you literally don't have enough dopamine. You just can't experience joy.
Yeah. So I mean, if she got out of bed before, you know, midday, that was pretty much a win. And so I was essentially a carer, but that wasn't really an issue because she's a gem, you know. She's true. And I could see who she was, you know. She's not a bad person at all.
Well, I think that I'm very lucky in that even in my worst state, even that I was still a nice person. Unfortunately, for some people, when they get ill, the way their illness manifests, they kind of lash out or they have paranoia, and it really affects their relationships. And my relationships throughout my life have been affected, definitely. Like, it's really, you know, relationships have been a big problem, but this one seemed to work. And you were able to withstand.
Yeah, I mean, the first time she got manic, I was away. I was doing a frog survey, interestingly enough, and it was around our first anniversary. And I was getting these increasingly odd text messages, and then they just petered out altogether. And I came back for a 400-kilometre drive at a great rate of knots, very concerned, and found Jane wandering around a neighbour's backyard in bare feet, even though they were the worst binges you've ever seen in your life. And she was catatonic. She was looking straight through me and just laughing like a maniac. And I couldn't get any sense of her out of her at all. And unfortunately, the person that, you know, had entrusted her into care didn't have any idea of what to do either. But we ended up getting her to hospital, the local hospital, and then she was taken by ambulance down to a psych ward the following day. that was really, really distressing because I was following the ambulance in my car.
It's a 3-hour drive.
And
we live in rural New South Wales.
Yeah, it was a long way to the psych ward. And when she got there, the ambulance went in the emergency vehicle bay, and I went round to get a car park. And by the time I got to the front entrance, I was like, "No, I want to see Jane." And they're like, "No, sorry, we can't let you see her." I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea what they were doing to her. I had no idea of anything, and it was a terrible position to be in.
You're very traumatized.
I was, yeah, it was bad. And Jane was, when she started to come out of the mania, she was scared that, oh my God, Alex is going to leave me. And
well, every relationship I'd ever been in ended basically because of my mental illness. Yeah.
Anyway, it had the opposite effect on me. I just wanted to look after it. And so, yeah. Anyway, but we went through 3 more episodes of that during the course of the relationship of this mania, at least 3. And she didn't always end up in hospital for various reasons. But it was full on. It was like Jane would not sleep and she would talk the whole time. And she would be in this elevated state for 10 days at a time, talking absolute gibberish and doing really dangerous things. And I would have to watch her like a hawk to make sure that she didn't die.
And it was only the nature of Alex's work. So Alex, he's a contractor. And so when he works, he goes away for 2 weeks at a time, but then he might be at home for a few weeks.
Yeah, so I was home. I was able to look after her. But it was... yeah, it was hard. It was scary. I was incredibly concerned about her. I knew what she was saying, what she was doing in her manic state wasn't actually Jane, it was her illness. But if I tried to direct her in particular directions to try to keep her safe, she'd often, turn on me.
And so this would happen even with the best
medications. Like
offered.
we'd be putting, I'd be on the phone to a psychiatrist saying, what do I do? And he'd be, have you tried upping the dose of this or trying doing that? And it was...
So even on medication, like I'd never been off medication, and every time I would try to go off medication, I ended up in hospital. So my life was 6 months of the year, being so depressed that I could hardly get out of bed. And then there would be 2 weeks of insanity.
Yeah. And absolutely craziness. Like you see craziness depicted on TV or in the movies. I have never seen craziness depicted like real craziness and so this was life for years. Yeah, it was hard. But like Jane wasn't born with this condition, and thought maybe we could sort it out.
So during this time, you were under the care of a psychiatrist, and you had a number of stays in hospital. What was your experience of that conventional medical model that we're in Australia, in the West?
I mean, I feel really grateful that I live in the country that I do live in that we have free healthcare. I will never criticize conventional psychiatry because it saved my life, and I'm definitely not anti-medication because medication saved my life, and medications save millions of people's lives and actually provide quality of life for a lot of people. I mean, our psychiatric care could improve, definitely.
Especially knowing what we know now.
Especially knowing what we know now, but the public health, the public hospitals, it's like it was traumatic going into hospital a lot of the time. We don't really need to go into that really, but even though it was traumatic, I needed to be there. In retrospect, I see that I needed to be there. But I think my criticism about public health system with regards to mental health is that there is limited preventative care. So I would get really ill and need hospitalization, and that was for emergency care, and then it was like, all right, you're not and then you get thrust back into the world, and I wasn't sick enough to be in hospital, but I wasn't well enough to be in the world, kind of thing. There is some intermediate health stay units, like in Newcastle, ISHMU, the intermediate mental health unit. It's fantastic. It's for people who don't need to be in emergency care, but like are not ready to be back in the world. And they, in that facility, they actually, you get one-on-one, you see a psychologist regularly, you see different kinds of therapists, you get training in just like day-to-day things that you know, how to do budgets, or even cooking and things like that. It's basic skills that a lot of people with mental illness don't have. But there's not enough of that, and it's definitely mental health is vastly underfunded everywhere, I believe. So
spoken about before, just even like some basic things, like we know how good exercise is for mental illness, we know how important nutrition is, and I know you've spoken before, your experience of being in hospital, those two really key fundamental things just weren't there. You had stays in hospitals where there just wasn't any space to even go for a walk, let alone jump on a treadmill or do some weights or...
I was locked up, and I'll say locked up. There was one point when I was not allowed to leave the ward for 6 weeks. I was in a hospital ward for 6 weeks. My only view of nature was this tiny little window to this tree outside, and I just wanted to go out. Like, I knew, I was just craving grass. I just wanted to put my feet on the grass. Yeah, that was really, really hard.
And so with that, Alex was the one who kind of had this idea of exploring FMT. What made you consider that as an option or a possibility that might help Jane?
This is a really, really tricky one, because I honestly cannot remember where I read this research, but I had read somewhere prior to November 2016, probably quite a long way prior to November 2016, about rats or mice, some rodent, laboratory rodent, that had the symptoms of depression, that were given the feces of healthy rodents, and their depression symptoms went away. There was also looking at rodents with obesity, and they'd done the same thing. And partly as a consequence of Jane's... Oh,
I remember.
Yeah, partly as a consequence of Jane's medications. Like, she'd put on, because she's given unfettered access to sugar in the hospital.
So one of the times where I went in the hospital, so to treat mania, they give you antipsychotic medication, and the antipsychotic medication that they gave me is a medication called Seroquel, and like 90% of people who take Seroquel have massive weight gain. So when I went into hospital, I was 60 kilos, and then within 6 weeks, I put on 25 kilos in 6 weeks from this medication. And what it does, it's like it turns off the part of your brain that says you're full, and it ramps up this, like, you crave carbohydrates like it's some kind of drug. All you think about is eating. It's this horrible drug, basically. And so Alex actually was like, why don't you try, we should try this for you, helped you lose weight. Because there was some preliminary evidence that showed that fecal transplants. I was like, there's no way I'm doing that for that. That's not a good enough reason to do something.
I was going to ask you, what were your thoughts when he first talked about this or put this idea to you?
I was horrified by the idea.
Yeah.
But then you found the article that linked it to mental illness.
Yeah. And then I found an article about depression, and I basically put it to her, and it took a long time.
There was 6 months. Come on, because it's a gross concept.
It's really gross.
Like I always say, when you enter a relationship, there's certain bodily fluids that you share, but not that. And so there were 6 months of me going, you want to do what? And at the time, like, now it makes a lot of sense to me because I've read so much, and it's just,
it's normal.
At the time, I didn't understand, like, what has my gut got to do with my mental illness? It was just such a foreign concept, because there was my doctors didn't tell me anything. There was nothing in the world of psychiatry or mental health kind of knowledge that even pointed to your gut having anything to do with mental illness. And so I think, yeah, there was 6 months of, that's gross.
Yeah,
and there was also no other person who had done it. We couldn't find anyone. So there was no evidence outside of rodent studies.
But I'm a zoologist, and we're mammals, and rodents. We're not. We tested our psychotropic drugs on rodents. It made sense to me that we are a community. We're an ecosystem, and this ecosystem. I knew that most of your serotonin is produced in the gut.
Well, you see, as an ecologist, what happens in the natural environment when an ecosystem is out of balance.
Yeah, you lose your biodiversity, and with that, you lose your resilience. The ecosystem becomes less resilient if it loses its biodiversity. So to me, that interplay between all those other hundreds of thousands of species that make up human beings, that made sense. That if they're out of balance, then it's going to affect the organism as a whole.
Well, and even thinking about evolution, the gut evolved before the brain. We've evolved alongside these,
bugs for millions and millions and millions and millions of years. We've had things living in our guts long before we were ever human beings or looked remotely like human beings.
But what made me finally decide to do it was my grandmother turned 88. She turned 88, and I remember sitting on our little swing seat in our garden and just crying, because I realized that just because I had a severe mental illness doesn't mean I don't have good genes in a way, and that I could possibly live that long. And at that point, I'd lived, 17, 18 years with this profoundly debilitating. I didn't even understand how I survived it, living with that level of suffering every day for that long, with no hope that that was my life and that was going to be my life.
It's incurable.
It's incurable.
You've got to lower your expectations, Jane. You're going to be with this for the rest of your life. You're going to be taking medication for the rest of your life.
And so the idea, the concept that I might live for another 50 years, it just horrified me. I was like, I can't do it. I just knew that I couldn't do it, which is why, like, you look at statistics, 1 in 5 people with bipolar disorder kill themselves. 20%. That's a lot of, that's not very good odds.
Yeah.
And then the other, and if you don't kill yourself, you live with profound suffering. And so that was when I'm like, well, I've got nothing to lose. The worst that can happen is nothing can happen. Like, it's a gross concept, but let's give it a go. But I wasn't willing to try it until I had spoke to my psychiatrist about it, because he manages my illness and he manages my medication, and I wanted to gauge his reaction. And we just lucked out that we've got a really forward-thinking,
we were so lucky,
psychiatrist who keeps up to date with the research. Because I had he lives in Newcastle and we're 7 hours away. So I had a phone call appointment with him, and I just said, Dr. Hinton, what do you think about fecal transplant and treating bipolar? That's all I said. I didn't say we're going to do it. I just asked him that question, and he goes, Jane, it's the medicine of the future. In 20 years, I'll be out of a job. In 20 years, they'll be able to analyze your gut microbiome and see what species you have missing, and they'll give you a tailored probiotic, and and all your symptoms will go away. Why do you ask? And so, because we're thinking of trying it. And there's this silence for a couple of seconds, and he said, I'd be really interested to see how that turns out. Tell me how that goes, which was like his thumbs up. But because there wasn't any human trials at that point, he's like, well, it's all animal studies at the moment, and it mightn't work, and blah blah, it's not clinically approved yet, so you'll have to do it at home, which is what we had to do. There are clinics around the world and in Australia that offers FMT, fecal transplant, in a clinical setting, but it's only for specific gastrointestinal problems, specifically an overgrowth called Clostridium difficile. And so we weren't able to do it in a clinical setting, which means we had to do it at home. And it just happened to be, was lucky that we had the psychiatrist that we did. And it was just incredibly lucky that Alex happened to be the perfect donor, perfect healthy donor who was safe, you know, this is a potentially dangerous thing to do, because you are literally transferring an ecosystem, you know. And so, like, if you
complete with any pathogens or
any
parasites,
any
or
viruses,
anything like that.
any, you know, if someone, you can transfer autoimmune issues. You know,
you can transfer obesity.
You can transfer obesity. You can transfer a mental illness. So, like, to have someone be a healthy donor, there's like a screening process, and that, you know, you have to have like a history questionnaire kind of thing. But luckily, Alex happened to be the perfect donor, and in November 2016, we
gave it a go
and got the equipment, and
used a blender in a whole new way.
We did.
Can you tell us exactly what that looks like? I'm sure people are fascinated by the process, and you know.
Well, yeah, everyone knows what it looks like. No, but basically, we found a YouTube video of a woman in the United States who was treating her daughter's Clostridium difficile. Like, even though you can get it done in a clinical setting, it's really expensive. Like, it's $10,000.
Wow.
You know, $6,000 to $10,000. It's not covered by Medicare in Australia. So it's out of the price range sometimes for even people who could get it in a clinical setting. So anyway, so there's lots of like DIY kind of videos available. And basically you just get like we just got this little $15 smoothie blender, and you get some saline solution, and you get these Fleet enema bottles.
And you poo in the blender.
Or you put the poo in the blender with some saline, and you whiz it up, and then you strain it. Yes, we know what whizzing sounds like.
Oh, you do it. I do it always in bursts.
And
short
then
bursts, and not for too long. You don't want to completely macerate the virus, the bacteria and things like that as well. You want some of those things to be alive, which is why you put the saline in as well.
And then you strain it through a metal strainer and pour it into the Fleet enema bottle, and then you bend over and bum up, head down, bum up, and squeeze it in and hold it in for as long as possible, and, you know, wait and see, basically.
But there were no protocols.
Sorry, what was that, Alex?
At the time we did it, there were no protocols. We didn't know how frequently we should do it. We didn't know
my question, you know, how frequently did you try this? What was the period of time? And, you know, how long did it take for you to see any changes in your condition?
Yeah, well, we did it maybe every 2 weeks, because we didn't even know if it was going to work. I didn't even know.
It was a shot in the dark.
It was a shot in the dark. And so we maybe did one every 2 weeks, and I didn't notice any improvement until the 3-month mark. So that was probably 6. We probably did 6 before I noticed an improvement. And then I started to notice improvement. And what that looked like within me it was just like this curve. Like, my depression became less and less and less. And it's the only way I can describe it. I just started feeling less and less depressed, and less and less depressed. And, you know, things like I started being able to get out of bed earlier, and I felt less shit. So to speak, for my swearing. I felt less crap. And then one day I clearly remember waking up, and there was this feeling that I had never experienced, never remember. It was like, what is this feeling? Is this what good feel? Do I feel good? It was this foreign feeling that I couldn't ever remember experiencing. And the good feeling, that was the day that my depression stopped. And that was sometime in March 2017. And I haven't been depressed since then. And basically the depression lifted, and then I started to
want to go for a run. And
yeah, there's one, I just started to experience motivation. Things became easier. Yeah, this is one day that I just felt like running. I had never felt like, I hadn't felt like running since I was 16. I just wanted to run, and I could get out of bed, and I started like feeling good for no reason. And then my anxiety started to reduce, and I started to feel good about life, where up until that point, like before I met Alex, I was ready to leave. Life was just a never ending experience of hell for me, and I didn't want to be here. And this body was the enemy, basically. And then when I met Alex and, you know, experienced his love, and then also the life that he created, like, you know, I walked into his life, and his life is a life in nature. As an ecologist, he spends the majority of his life in nature, and he introduced the natural world to me, which I fell in love with. And so it was like when I met Alex, I had a reason to live, but I still suffered a lot. And when I started to, so after 6 FMTs, I started to feel better, and I was like, well, this is actually working. So we did 4 more. And in the space of probably, so from March 2017, when my depression ended, March, April, May, June, July. So within 5 months, I was like, good. I was 100% symptom free, basically, in the sense that at the beginning, when I started to feel good, I didn't trust it, because I knew historically when I started to feel good, I was going to feel really good very quickly. And then it was like, oh, I'm going to heal the world. I am, you know, talking to God, talking to aliens, and so I didn't trust the good feeling, because I was always waiting to become manic, and I just didn't become manic. I just kept feeling good. And yeah, it's an interesting experience, and I don't fully know if I can kind of articulate it. I just stopped being depressed, and I started to feel good. And then, like, I'm still the same person, but my whole perspective changed, and I started to like myself, and I started to love life. And yeah, it was extremely transformative. And by August 2017, I was so well that I decided to talk to my psychiatrist about going off my medication, which you just don't do. If you have bipolar 1 disorder, you're on medication for life. And going off medication was always a really dangerous thing to do. And so he was hesitant, but he agreed to experiment with going off medications. And we went off too quickly, and I did become manic during that time, but I haven't been manic since then. And I haven't been on medication since then either, which is unprecedented. You don't, like, there were some professionals, there were some researchers that were pretty skeptical about our story for a while, but the longer I remain well, the more obvious it is that, like, it's still a controversial thing to say that we cured it, but we know we've cured it. My psychiatrist says I'm in remission, but that's 3 years of remission. That does not happen. It might happen with bipolar 2. You could go this long with bipolar 2 disorder and not have symptoms, but not bipolar 1. You just don't. You don't get over it. You don't get over it. Yeah. Especially not being on medication.
Wow, that's an incredible story and journey. And so what does life look like for you now? How have you come out of this? What's your life look like together?
I've got an upgrade. Yeah, of course we got married. And
we've written 2 books together.
And published them.
Yeah.
And won an award.
Won some awards, yeah. Award-winning authors.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the books.
Yeah.
Well, so Alex has worked as an environmental educator since 1990, and during that time he's always used poetry as a form of interpretation during his activities in national parks or with land care events and things. And for decades everyone was saying, you should write a book, and he never got around to it. And then when I came on the scene, I was like, that's it, we're doing it. So I made it happen.
She did. There's no doubt about that.
And so, yeah, I helped make the first book happen, and we self-published for a number of reasons. And from when the book was published, we were offered these grants to go into schools and run some, like, environmental education activities around the book, which was really great. I was still kind of getting well at that point. And then we spent every summer in Tasmania. Alex works for Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife as a discovery ranger, which is like an educational ranger. And so we wrote a book of Tasmanian themed poetry, Fauniverse, Wildlife and Poetry Tasmania, which won a Whitley Award, a Royal Zoological Society Whitley Book Award last year, which is a huge deal for us.
Yeah, it was good. So yeah, I mean that's good. I don't have to worry about saying to Jane, have you taken your medication first thing in the morning or last thing at night?
Mm.
But just that little thing makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Well, it just means now that like I can actually create a life, whereas when I was like ill, it was survival. So I mean, I'm still learning how to be an adult, if that makes sense. 18 years is a really long time to experience profound mental illness. And it was those formative years. It was, 16 to 35. That's my whole adult life, when I missed out on creating, working out who I am and working out what I want in life and developing skills. So I'm kind of like, I feel behind a lot. But at the same time, I'm pretty proud of what I've achieved in the last 2 years that I've been well. Like I keep pushing kind of boundaries of, I mean, the fecal transplant absolutely eliminated my bipolar symptoms, but it didn't do anything to eliminate my trauma. Trauma is a different issue. And so the last 2 years, especially, I've been really working on healing my trauma through a variety of means. I mean, you really helped me, Michelle, with your training me with breathing techniques. I still experience some anxiety and a bit of social phobia, but I'm like, that's a process. And a therapy that's been extraordinarily helpful that I practice basically daily is a therapy called trauma release exercises, which it's absolutely changed me and in a really profound way is healing my trauma, and I feel like my neural pathways are changing, like my whole perspective is changing, because trauma changes your brain. It literally changes your brain structure. It changes how you see yourself and the world. And if you have trauma, it gets locked in your body, and it trains your fight or flight mechanism to be overactive. And you can explain that more.
Yeah.
But so basically,
TRE is an incredible modality as well. I've trained in that as well as yoga therapy, and they don't quite know exactly how it works, but there's something about in trauma you can re-experience the traumatic event as if it's happening in real time. So when you recall that, your body goes into that fight and flight. You have this memory like it's now. And what the TRE does is recompartmentalize those memories to a different part of the brain where your other kind of, let's say, normal memories are. And when you think about it, it is just like, oh yeah, that thing happened. It's not like you're experiencing it. And, that can take a number of weeks or months of doing the TRE to get to that place. But yeah, it's a very interesting and transformative modality, as well as the yoga therapy, which we've also done together.
Yeah, for sure. You explained it so well. I mean, with that's what's so remarkable about it. It's like one thing that has been profound in the last year, especially, is gaining a connection to my body, because with severe mental illness, basically I disconnected from my body, and in a very big way, to the point where I used to look in the mirror and not even recognize that was me. Basically, the person that I wouldn't accept it. There was a level of self-hatred, but there was also a level of disconnection. I think if you're at a point where you've given up on life and where you don't want to be here, you know, you disconnect. And I think I would used to go into my imagination to the point where when I become manic, I would leave my body. And so learning how to inhabit my body has been a huge thing in the last year and a half. And yoga is really good for that. And like just any exercise is good for that, but yoga is really fantastic for that, because you have the breathing and you're so focused, you know, you're really focused in the body. And I think the trauma release exercises, basically it's just helped me feel safe in my body, because some of the traumas that I've had were so great that, you know, like that I couldn't stand reliving it, or it was like I didn't process them properly. Where the trauma release exercises, it's like you relive them, but you're in a safe perspective. And it's like, yeah, like you say, my brain, it's like my brain says, oh, that thing that was in the past, you're safe now. You know, you're not 6 anymore. You're not 16 anymore. Yeah. So
that process of the TRE, you don't actually have to go into that memory at all. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to, you know, some people find they don't want to talk about their trauma because it can be re-traumatizing. And with that particular modality, it's not about that. It's not a talking therapy. It's a body-based therapy where you do these specific exercises and you induce a tremoring in the body. And the tremoring, somehow through our nervous system, reprocesses in our brain. It's a fascinating thing, but you don't actually have to go into the traumatic memory. It's just,
I know, it's like you go under the iceberg. You go, you know, talk therapy deals with your conscious mind, and it just goes straight into it. And I mean, I have done a lot of talk therapy in my life, and it has been helpful, but it has never profoundly healed me. Whereas this body-based stuff, TRE and you know, meditation and yoga has really helped me so much. And so the healing my gut, that totally, you know, healed depression and mania. Like that cured the bipolar for sure. But then it gave me space to actually then deal with these underlying traumas that contributed to me developing bipolar. I mean, mental illness is it's a multi-layered thing. I think it's you know, and so
it does require a multi-layered approach.
It does, yeah. And so now I kind of holistically approach staying well, because now, you know, now that I'm well, I want to stay well. And it's like, well, how do I stay well? And a huge thing that I've changed is my diet. Like doing a fecal transplant, that's probably out of the realm of like possibility or even desirability for most people. But one thing that everyone can do is change your diet. It's interesting, 3 years ago, telling people our story, it's interesting how the reactions have changed over time.
It's huge.
Like people are aware of the gut these days, whereas 3 years ago it was kind of like,
you did what?
You did what?
And now they go, oh yeah, I've heard that could work. No, so yeah, it's been really interesting how rapidly people have come to accept that what goes on in the gut can actually affect what goes on in the head.
Yeah. And so,
yeah, it is still a new concept for people though, but I really want to recommend this book to people. It's called Brain Changer by Professor Felice Jacka. The latest cutting edge science on how diet can affect your risk of anxiety and depression and influence the health of your brain. So Professor Felice Jacka is a world-renowned nutritional psychiatrist, and she heads the Food and Mood Center out of Deakin University, and they've done, like, she's a leading authority in diet and mental health outcomes, and they do clinical trials into diet and mental health. In fact, next year, they're, depending on how the COVID-19 situation plays out, but they're hoping to launch a clinical trial treating major depressive disorder with crapsules, so poo pills. Which,
going that way, right?
Going that way. Top-down method instead of bottom-up method.
That's at Deakin University in Melbourne, is that right?
That's Deakin University in Melbourne, yeah. So
Australia.
yeah, major depressive disorder is the world's leading cause of disability. And bipolar disorder is something like number 5. So millions, you know, what does that say? That the number 1 leading cause of disease burden with regards to disability is mental illness. Yeah.
And so you just touched on diet there. Like if people didn't want to, you know, go down this route of FMT or, you know, wanted to think about it for a while, what other things could they do for their gut biome through nutrition in the meantime?
Well, there's lots you can do. Basically, the most, there is no one size fits all diet for everyone. But the diet that has the most scientific outcomes or studies surrounding it is the Mediterranean diet. And all the research is showing it's about variety of fibers. It's so it's about eating prebiotic and probiotic fibers, and if you have a diversity of fibers, then that feeds the good bacteria. So you want to feed the good bacteria, and what they've shown is, unsurprisingly, a diet high in refined carbohydrates, sugar, etc. You're feeding the wrong kinds of bacteria. So really a plant-based, high percentage of plant, lots of fibers, nuts, diversity of plants, grains, you know, legumes, etc. A little bit of red meat. There is lots of research that shows that red meat is necessary. Well, it shows positive mental health outcomes. A little bit. Yeah. But specifically for bipolar, I'm not sure if following a Mediterranean diet is going to cure your bipolar.
If people are actually missing those bugs to begin with,
you can't.
A change of diet won't necessarily bring them back, and that's the issue.
Yeah.
But there's definitely evidence for anxiety disorders and mild depression, or even to major depression. You can have good outcomes with, you know, switching to a Mediterranean style diet. There are a lot of anecdotal stories that I've come across of people who are controlling their bipolar symptoms through a ketogenic diet. And I tried a ketogenic diet for a while and I felt fantastic, but it's just a diet that's really hard to stick to. And I was concerned about the long term because it's like high fat, you know, high fat, very low carbohydrates. And I didn't think it was enough fiber, but there are people who are controlling their bipolar symptoms through a ketogenic diet. And I've noticed myself in the last couple of weeks, I've let sugar and refined carbohydrates back into my life, and I'm definitely feeling the consequences in my mood. So even now that I'm well, even though I'm well, and you know I haven't experienced depression, etc. I can tell within myself if I sugar is a big thing for me. It definitely affects my mood, and it affects my sleep, and and I also recommend nature. I think people take nature for granted, or I don't even know
they're like Woody Allen. Oh, I like nature, I just don't want to get it on me. But nature is incredibly important. Like if you think about the fact that human beings have been human beings for, you know, like 1 to 2 million years, and for most of that history we were in nature. We were walking around in the forest, we were listening to bird songs, we weren't surrounded by billboards and straight lines and right angles and things like that.
And we also weren't surrounded by thousands of people a day.
No, well, that's true too.
Yeah.
We lived in small groups, and we were eating varied diets, and the smells and the sounds, and a lot of it's subtle and it's all around, and you'd be attuned to that because the sound of a bunch of birds suddenly taking off could mean that there's a predator over there, or the sound of a particular type of bird might mean there's a food source over there. So you'd be listening to the sounds of nature, probably unconsciously a lot of the time, and the smells. And I think that that's a really big part of our neural network, that we're not engaging in urban environments anymore.
Well, certainly when I moved to the bush and when I started hanging out with a zoologist who spends 99% of his life in the bush, I definitely noticed an improvement in my mental health, even before we started the treatment, the fecal transplant. And then I discovered this amazing book, another book recommendation called The Nature Fix by Florence Williams, why nature makes us happier, healthier, and more creative. So this woman, she traveled the world, and I didn't realize until I read this book that the amount of research that has been conducted to show that nature actually improves your mental health or in your physical well-being and creativity.
You have to tell me.
No, I know, but the thing is, it seems, well, it makes sense that nature is good for you, but you can quantify it. So they've shown that just being in a forest, plants produce these phytochemicals that you breathe in, and breathing in those chemicals actually causes a dopamine response.
Yeah, I think in some countries there's even they're prescribing forest bathing, walking in the forest as a prescription for certain health conditions, including mental health conditions. I think maybe in Japan or the Netherlands, maybe in some of the Scandinavian countries.
Well, it started in Japan, and I just thought it was like forest bathing was this hippie idea. I was like, no, that the Japanese government had invested millions of dollars into these forest bathing centers, and people would go, and before they do the forest bathing, they'd be connected. They have their biometrics tested, they have their cortisol levels tested, and their blood pressure, and all this, and then they would be taken into nature, on walks, or they do yoga or whatever. They do these various nature forest bathing kind of activities, and then they would get their biometrics tested again, and then they would get followed up. So there was they're collecting data, and basically being in nature, it reduces your cortisol levels, it reduces your stress hormones, and it promotes, dopamine. Yeah. And there is an absolute dose curve. So the more time you spend, the better you're going to feel. And it doesn't have to be a forest. We're really blessed that we step out their door and we're in the bush, but even a bit of green space, sitting under a tree, going to a park is going to improve your mental health.
Yeah. Or even, through lack of, if someone doesn't have access to that immediately, even sitting outside on the grass, connecting directly with the earth is grounding. That's shown to be grounding,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's an incredible story. I'm so amazed that the journey you've been on, where you came from to where you are now, and the incredible things you've managed to achieve since becoming well. It's not just a journey, as you said, of just survival, it's really of thriving. And I'm so proud of you and congratulate you both on the journey that you've been on and where you are.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Is there any final things that you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Sure. Well, now we're not the only people in the world who have had success treating bipolar with fecal transplant. So after seeing my success, my two older sisters, Catherine and Dione, who also have bipolar disorder, they have bipolar 2 disorder, and suffered, they were quite debilitated by their illness as well. After seeing my success, they decided to give the treatment a go as well, with Alex as their donor. And so last February 2019, they started the treatment, and because we had an better idea of how to do it, they had kind of successive treatments.
It's much more intense.
Yeah. And they improved quicker. They improved more quickly. And so my sister Catherine, she was quite functionally disabled, and
she had really severe anxiety,
really severe depression, and then hypomania. She hasn't had depression since March last year. So they're they're highly functioning now. They're still getting better. They're still improving. I mean, as am I, even like 2 years after we stopped doing it, just different ways. So my sisters have improved. And then after finding my story, I have a friend in Peru who has bipolar 2 disorder, and he was an engineer and he had to quit his job and he was suicidal and his relationship was breaking down, and he was desperate, and he decided to give it a go under the guidance of his own psychiatrist, and his nephew was a healthy donor, and now he's completely symptom free and off all medications. And there's another woman in India who's having dramatic improvement. And so, I mean, these are just anecdotal cases, but they're really powerful anecdotal cases. And as you said at the beginning, our case study, my psychiatrist wrote up our case study, and amazingly it was accepted in a really well-respected psychiatric journal, which means that it's now valid. Like, our story is now part of the scientific literature, and various researchers are excited about that, because that means that they can now cite my case for clinical trials, etc. And there is a clinical trial that should be finishing this year in Canada, treating bipolar disorder with fecal transplant. So we're really interested to see what comes of that. And I think, as out there as this idea was 3 years ago and kind of still is now, targeting the microbiome to treat mental illness, I think it's the medicine of the future, and it will become commonplace, I believe. Things like psychobiotics, which are probiotics, specifically designed to treat mental illness. There's the Cork University in Ireland. They're like forefronts of psychobiotics, using probiotics to help with anxiety and depression, or Deakin University with their dietary clinical trials. So diet, probiotics, and in instances where that wouldn't work, fecal transplant could be commonplace to treat mental illness. And the thing is, we don't know how many people it can help, but even if 10% of people that experience mental illnesses, if it's related to their gut, that's multi-millions of people around the world. So we're really excited to see how it will evolve over the next 10 years. And also, we didn't know it was going to work for me, and then it has, and now we're excited to see who else could be helped.
Yeah, it's really exciting, the future of this.
Yeah, well, it worked well beyond my greatest expectations, without a doubt. It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
And how many people have loved ones that suffer, and you want to help them, and I think it's amazing. Like, you really helped me. You saved my life, and I'm well because of Alex, and my sisters are now well. You've the family changed the life of 3 people, and our family. Thank you.
True pioneers in this, and it will go on to help so many people.
Yeah, we're excited to see. So we're really, really grateful for this opportunity to share our story, Michelle. Thank you.
An incredible story. And if people did want to get some more information or connect with you, are they able to do that?
Oh, yes. Well, with mental illness, all you have to do is Google gut microbiome and bipolar, or gut microbiome, anxiety, or depression, and your world will open up to the articles of research that are there. But with regards to our story specifically, we have a blog. I don't really update it very often, but it's called whathavewedung.com, whathavewedung.com. And so on that blog there's more there's links to the clinical trials and to other interviews that I've had, and also links to research papers and journal articles relating to the gut microbiome and mental illness, etc. And you'll also find out an email address there if you wanted to contact and find more information.
That's great. And I love the play on words there. I know Alex is a big fan.
You didn't pun that much.
No, I've been very, very controlled.
I saw you holding your tongue in the pioneers.
Yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for telling your story. It's
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, no worries, Michelle.
I mean, it's a great story. I love telling it. I mean, it's it's almost miraculous.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. Your psychiatrist said if he hadn't seen it, he wouldn't have believed it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole story is miraculous, from a magical frog to magical transformation through
I know.
FMT.
It's true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and I'll speak to you guys again soon. Take care.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michelle.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.